Hello, this is Max. Today, I will tell you a story about how a father and his son lured a criminal into committing an unspeakable act, which led to terrible consequences for their family. You can subscribe to the channel after watching. It helps us a lot in realizing the content. During a storm, Chris seeks shelter at his father Ansel's place, where his stepmother Charla welcomes him. Arguments erupt immediately, fueled by Charla's assumption that Chris was ousted by his mother Adele. Ansel intervenes, and Chris asks to stay for the night. As tensions escalate, Charla slaps Chris, awakening his sister Dottie. Chris discloses to his father his dire need for $6,000 to save his life. Despite Chris's pleas, Ansel claims he doesn't possess that amount. The two men head to a nightclub, where Chris explains his predicament, involving his stolen merchandise and impending threats from suppliers. Ansel reiterates his financial inability, prompting Chris to suggest involving Joe Cooper, a detective and hitman. Adele's $50,000 life insurance policy designates Dottie as the sole beneficiary. Chris proposes using the insurance money to pay Joe, splitting the remainder among themselves. Ansel suggests sharing with Charla as well, but Chris initially resists. Chris eventually concedes, yet Ansel points out that he hasn't agreed to the liquidation plan. During the drive home, Chris argues that his mother's death wouldn't garner much concern, and Dottie would be better off with the insurance money. Dottie sleepwalks out, prompting Chris to inquire about her dating life. Ansel chuckles at her inexperience. Inside the trailer, Dottie reveals that she overheard their conversation and supports the idea of liquidating their mother. On the following day, the hitman, known as Killer Joe, arrives at the trailer. At this point, Dottie is found mimicking martial arts moves. The observer, realizing the need for proper instruction rather than TV imitation, suggests getting her a teacher. In the absence of Chris, she makes coffee while awaiting her brother. Inquisitive about Joe's occupation, Dottie learns he's a detective with the Dallas Police Department. The conversation shifts to Joe's past experiences involving shooting incidents. As dialogue unfolds, a ringing phone prompts Dottie to advise Joe to answer, as it's for him. Indeed, the caller is Chris, arranging to meet nearby due to his father's work commitments. He requests Joe to bring Dottie along since she knows the way. Seizing the moment, Dottie directly questions Joe about his potential role in her mother's demise. She discloses her traumatic past, wherein her mother attempted to harm her during infancy. Intrigued by Dottie's backstory, Joe arrives at a billiards establishment close to Ansel's workshop. Prioritizing discretion, Joe surveys the area to ensure no eavesdroppers. He's uninterested in the motive behind the job, but seeks intricate details about the target's routines and behaviors. Joe establishes a crucial rule. In the event of capture, their identities must remain hidden, else he'll eliminate them. He also demands a $25,000 cash advance, which catches the men off guard. Chris explains their inability to provide an advance due to their reliance on insurance money for payment. Consequently, Joe declines the assignment. Chris attempts negotiation, but Joe stands firm and departs. Outside, he observes Dottie dancing happily in the sunlight, inspiring a new proposition. Joe suggests retaining Dottie, prompting Chris to grasp the implication. Before leaving, Joe encourages them to contact him if Dottie expresses interest. Subsequently, a father-son dispute arises, with Ansel suggesting they liquidate Adele themselves. Chris, however, acknowledges their inability to follow through with this plan. Afterward, Charla is seen at the pizza diner where she works, speaking on the phone while looking at private photos. She assures the person on the line that their face isn't visible in the pictures. Inquiring about her pickup time, Dottie interrupts to ask for money for dinner. After the call, Charla suggests giving Dottie extra money for a new dress, hinting at a guest's arrival. Dottie playfully speculates that Charla was talking to a boyfriend earlier, a notion that Charla denies. Dottie then confides that she once had a boyfriend with whom she never spent time or conversed, believing his affection was pure and untouched by conversation. Charla smiles at her whimsical stepdaughter. Dottie suspects that Joe is their guest and notes that she saw herself in his eyes. Ansel joins them, and Charla encourages him to buy Dottie a new dress. Ansel agrees. To obtain money, Charla takes Ansel downstairs and presses him about revealing the truth to Dottie. Charla expresses concern for Dottie and instructs Ansel to inform her so she can prepare for the evening. Dottie puts on the new dress but confides in her father that she feels uncomfortable. Ansel reveals that she'll only be having supper with Joe, causing Dottie anxiety. She retreats to her room, refusing to meet Joe in the dress. Chris arrives and defends Dottie during an argument with Ansel and Charla. Just as Joe arrives, Chris assures him that they are about to leave. Ansel and Chris exit to give Joe alone time with Dottie. Meanwhile, a yellow sports car arrives at a motel, and Charla greets the driver, sharing an affectionate kiss. Back at the house, Joe checks on Dottie, finding her in tears and her bedroom locked. He grants her time alone. Eventually, Dottie emerges, and Joe shares his childhood experiences and disillusionment with his hometown. They sit down for a candlelit dinner, and Dottie asks about Joe's plan to kill her mother. Joe evades the question, intrigued by her nonchalant approach to the topic. Dottie recounts her parents' divorce and how her mother admitted to never loving her father, breaking her heart. Joe instructs her to put on the previously bought dress in front of him. As she does, Joe discreetly puts away his handcuffs, gun, and police badge. Chris arrives outside, concerned for Dottie. The next day, Chris tries his luck at a horse racing tournament, hoping for an alternative way to secure the money. As he exits, two people start chasing him. Catching up to him, their boss named Digger arrives and tells him that he must pay him within 2 days, otherwise he'll be taken care of. Digger orders his men to kick him, which they do. In the evening, Chris returns home all beaten up. Joe, who is staying in Dottie's room, asks what happened, and Chris says that he was beaten up by Digger's people for not repaying the debt. The following day, Chris has a private conversation with Joe, raising concerns about his involvement with Dottie while their mother is still alive. Joe assures Chris that he will carry out the task that night but won't leave Dottie until he's paid. Overwhelmed by guilt, Chris decides he doesn't want Joe near his sister. However, Joe states that he will only depart if he receives payment or if the deal is canceled. Chris questions why Joe hasn't arrested Digger, who is involved in illegal activities, despite being aware of his actions. Joe explains that he has a personal affinity for Digger. That evening, Joe retrieves his gun from the police station and prepares to leave. As he exits, Chris implores him to call off the plan and end his relationship with Dottie. Chris feels remorseful about involving his sister in such a scheme. Joe instructs Chris to accompany him for a drive. During the drive, Chris shares his own story, detailing how he became involved in selling Digger's products. He hopes to connect with Joe and sway his decision. Despite Chris's efforts, Joe remains unresponsive. Chris continues to plead with him to leave his sister. Eventually, they arrive at a diner far from town. Joe then discloses a grim truth: Adele's lifeless body is already in his car trunk. Left with no alternative, Chris assists Joe in moving the body into Adele's car's driver's seat. Joe stages the scene by spilling whiskey and blowing cigarette smoke, creating the illusion that Adele had been drinking and smoking in her car. Afterward, Joe sets the car ablaze and drives away. The subsequent day, Chris and Dottie have lunch outside the insurance office. Meanwhile, Ansel and Charlotte manage things inside. Soon, Ansel and Charlotte exit the office and advise the siblings to meet them at the back of the diner. Ansel confronts Chris about his knowledge of Adele's insurance policy. Chris explains that he learned about it from Adele's boyfriend, Rex, several weeks ago. Angrily, Ansel reveals that Rex, not Dottie, is the actual beneficiary of the policy. This revelation means they don't have access to the money. Charlotte suspects Rex intentionally misled Chris. Ansel questions Chris about who referred Killer Joe to him. This realization dawns on Chris: Rex was the one who connected them to the hitman. As Ansel drives away to attend the funeral, he instructs Chris to find a way to pay both Digger and Joe. As Chris and Dottie walk, Chris proposes leaving town and invites Dottie to come along. Dottie, however, wishes to see Joe. She begins walking in the direction of his car, prompting Chris to catch up. He promises her they can see Joe after the funeral before departing. Dottie agrees but insists on not informing Joe or their father about their plans. Feeling more optimistic, Chris reassures her that their plan will succeed. Dottie adds that everything should work out unless something upsets her at the funeral. The funeral for Adele is attended by only a few people, and Rex is notably absent. Following the service, Chris drops Dottie off at the trailer to gather her belongings. Meanwhile, at sundown, Joe pulls over the yellow sports car on the road. At the same time, Chris meets up with a friend to acquire a gun. That evening, Ansel and Charla return home and discover Joe stepping out of Dottie's room. He informs them that Dottie is asleep, and they invite him to join them for dinner. While eating, Charla brings up the insurance matter, and Joe is already aware that the plan didn't go as intended. She begins to criticize Chris, expressing her belief that he would fail. Her comments spark an argument between her and Ansel about their son. He suddenly questions Charla about Rex, making her uncomfortable. She evades the question, but Joe persists, asking why she didn't advise Ansel against the plan when she was sure Chris would fail. She claims it wasn't her concern, but Joe disagrees, considering she stood to gain a share of the money. As Joe interrogates Charla, Ansel watches without intervening. Charla defends herself, admitting her financial motives, which forces her to sit down. Joe questions her about the amount she was supposed to receive, leading to confusion about the insurance policy's value. Joe smashes their TV in anger and reveals that the policy doubles the money in case of accidental death. Charla insists that she was informed of this change that morning, leading to her earlier misunderstanding. Joe takes things further by displaying private photos of Charlotte with an unidentified man. Ansel confirms that he is not the man in the photos. Joe concludes that Charlotte was also involved with Rex romantically. She denies the accusation, and when she tries to provoke Joe, he chokes her until she confesses her secret relationship with Rex. Desperate and defeated, Charla offers to give Joe the money, but he reveals that Rex had already given him a worthless check earlier. Negotiating to bring Rex back to pay, Charla's plan fails as Joe points out that Rex is unavailable. Joe torments her, revealing her boyfriend's absence and punching her. As Joe's control over the situation intensifies, he demands payment for his services. Recognizing their inability to pay, he claims Dottie as his retainer. He insists that they prevent Chris from taking Dottie away, threatening their lives. Ansel and Charla agree reluctantly. When Chris arrives, Joe pretends as if everything is normal, even greeting him warmly while holding Dottie. Joe orchestrates a seemingly typical dinner gathering, and Dottie leads a prayer before they start eating. Joe then announces his engagement to Dottie and proposes a toast. However, Chris refuses to let Joe take his sister and asserts his intention to leave with her. Tensions escalate as Chris aims his gun at Joe. Charla, armed with a knife, unexpectedly stabs Chris, allowing Joe to overpower and beat him. Dottie pleads for Joe to stop hurting her brother, while Ansel and Charla join in assisting Joe's assault. In a desperate turn of events, Dottie seizes the gun and begins shooting wildly. Tragically, Chris is killed, and Ansel is wounded in the stomach. Joe tries to calm Dottie, but she points the gun at him, revealing that she's pregnant. This revelation sparks a glint of interest in Joe's eyes. Dottie contemplates shooting the father of her child, holding her finger on the trigger. If you are interested in such films, please proceed to the next video on the screen and also share your thoughts about this film in the comments. Give us a like and subscribe. Goodbye.